I just forget to unmute myself. Hi, everyone. Welcome to the fourth lecture in the spring 2025 edition of the Lubalin lecture series, part of TypeCulture. My name is Alexander. I'm one of the instructors in the program, and it's my pleasure to have you join us. I wanted to of course, state that the lecture series is part of TypeCulture, which is the certificate program, postgraduate program in typeface design with a certificate program built in, but lots of other workshops and other content that is offered. It's part of Cooper Union and the Lubalin Center. Along with TypeCulture organizes these lectures. They're part of the curriculum, and we have usually 12 lectures every year. So it's a long-standing series. I'm going to try as much as I can to give you all of the links in the chat, as always. Just 1 second. There we go. And change my slides. Super quickly about a little housekeeping, as always, for those who this is not new, you know the drill, but for folks who are maybe new to the webinar, the chat function, it has two toggles. You could message everyone who's watching, or you can message just the hosts and panelists, which is basically the team behind the scenes. So make sure if you're chatting with everybody, make sure that in the chat window, the two dialogue at the top where it says type message here above that is toggled to everyone instead of host and panelists. But if you have a message for the team, just toggle back to host and panelists. We will have a Q&A at the end, about 15 minutes or so. So send your questions in the Q&A window. Try not to send them in the chat. We might lose them in the chat. So if you have questions, make sure you're sending them into the Q&A window. Just it's another button at the bottom of your Zoom screen. The links we'll be posting in the chat as well. There's unfortunately not a easy way to make a recording of the transcript of the chat savable. So you just click the links as they come up if you want to look at them later. That's the best bet to kind of keep the links. And the talk is being recorded. It's going to be available on YouTube. It's already on YouTube. So if you look at the top of your Zoom, you should see a little YouTube icon. If you have to leave for any reason, if you wanted to make sure you wanted to catch this as soon as the recording, as soon as the event is over, just open up the YouTube and watch there. First and foremost, I wanted to give a huge thank you to TypeCulture, a fantastic educational resource, and a fantastic Type Foundry, who are generous in helping us sponsor the recording of this lecture and to keep building out the collection of lectures that we have going back about nearly 10 years now. So thank you to TypeCulture, and I'm going to post the link to them. If you're not familiar, do check them out. We have, as I mentioned, this is our fourth lecture in the lecture series. We have had 3 previous lectures in the series, is what I'm trying to say. Ben Furmanley spoke a few weeks ago. That lecture is already available. Jordi Duro spoke about the typography of the 1930s in Spain. That lecture is going to be posted soon. Actually, it's already posted, so the link down below you see. And then this past Monday, we had a lecture by Tobias Farrer-Jones that's going to be available soon. In a few days, you should be able to see it probably next week or so. So we have 3 fantastic lectures that are already available. 2 that are available, 3rd is coming up. You can find all of that in these 2 locations, and to make it easy, I'm going to do the same, just multitask, put them in the chat. So if you missed any of these, do check them out. We will have 4 more lectures in the summer. So these are the 4 lectures that we'll have. 2 of these will open around typographics, which is coming up. I have a note about that, a little slide for that. But we have David Heasty on June 23rd. Tomasz Lava will speak on June 30th, and then Agnieszka Minareko will speak on July 14th, and Kinohi Nishikawa will present on July 28th. All of those are going to be in person in the Rose Auditorium here at Cooper Union, and also live streamed through YouTube. So you can catch one of these in either function to make it easy. You can register. So these talks are not posted. Information is not available yet. We're gathering that material. But if you go to this link, you could sign up for a mailing list, and we always announce the lectures that we have coming up through our mailing list. So keep an eye on that. If you're not subscribed, join the list. And of course, as I mentioned, Typographics, our 11th edition of Typographics is coming up. This year it's going to be June 27th and 28th, which is the conference itself. But as always, Typographics is a big festival. There's a lot of workshops around it, a lot of studio tours, walking tours. Type Lab will be happening. There'll be a book fair, so lots and lots of stuff that is parallel to the conference. So lots of things, and there's everything from free events to completely remote events to the conference. So lots of opportunities for you to join. The conference itself will have these amazing speakers. We've just finished announcing all of them to the public. And most importantly, you can still get the early bird tickets until May 15th. So don't wait to get the tickets as much as you know, the price will change. But it's a really interesting lineup. We're very excited to have this 11th edition with this kind of stellar lineup of folks. So that's it for the housekeeping announcements. I would love to introduce our speaker today and give you a little bit of a sense of his a little bit of background, and through his lecture you'll get to see quite a bit more about the research that Julien has been doing. So Julien Van Anholt is a publisher and a poet, one who also is conducting research into hand-painted intertitles in silent films. This is something that is obviously the key topic of today's presentation. This is something that he began back in 2021 at ANRT, the Atelier National de Recherche Typographique. Julien lives and works in Paris, where he runs Estimirant Stella. He writes stanzas and sends by post discrete magazines. Without further ado, I would love to introduce and invite Julien to this virtual stage of ours. Thanks so much, Julien.
Thank you very much. I'm glad to be here with you all. And let's share slides now. So hello everyone. First of all, I would like to thank Alexander for the invitation and all the people from the Lubalin Center and Cooper Union for organizing this lecture series. And I will start with a few words to introduce myself, although Sasha already told different things about me. So my name is Julien and I was born in Paris, France, where I studied literature. And I'm currently working for a French publishing house specialized in art exhibition catalogs. So I'm coming more from the editorial field, but through the years, while reading and proofreading texts, while editing books on my own also, I got a strong interest in typography. So in 2021, I decided I wanted to dig into more type-related things, and I applied to ANRT, the Atelier de Recherche Typographique, a postgraduate research course based in Nancy, in the east of France, and dedicated to type design and type researches. Down there, I studied what are known as intertitles. As you may know, intertitles were used in silent films to compensate for the absence of sound. They were used, for example, to indicate a temporal ellipsis, as here, to introduce a character, or to establish a dialogue, or simply to give details about places, whether very specific or more vague but evocative, as in this example from the movie Nanook of the North. So intertitles had a structuring function for filmmakers. They were densifying the narrative. They were also helping the cinema to develop its own language. But the fact of introducing some text amongst the images had a major drawback, because intertitles, they created a strong break in the flow of moving images. They are also sometimes referred to as cards or cartons in French, which means cardboards. And this word of card gives a finer idea of the materiality of intertitles, because cardboard is indeed a rigid paper on which to print letters or to trace them by hand using various tools. It is not only a vector of meaning or a conceptual tool for bringing written language to the screen, but an object. I mean, an object in the physical sense of the term. So this word of card is of particular interest to me, because I think that too few people have been examining this tangible dimension of the intertitle, even though it could reveal many interesting things about the history of cinema in general. For example, intertitles, they tell us a great deal about film studios' strategies, about the commercial logic in the cinema industry, and of course about filmmaking intentions, depending on the degree of aesthetic consideration given to the letters into the films. Very often, the intertitles were seen as mere instruments at the service of the cinema. To quote the French director Marcel L'Herbier, they were crutches. Or to quote other contemporaries of silent films, the intertitle is an encumbrance, a necessary evil, or even a last resort condemned to death. In other words, intertitles are something very practical, but also very annoying to filmmakers. In this beautiful book, entitled Bonjour Cinéma, the filmmaker Jean Epstein summed up quite bluntly the prevailing ideology at the beginning of the 21st century. He actually wrote "Pas de texte, le vrai film s'en passe," meaning no text, the real film does without. And his statement echoes another well-known phrase by Friedrich Murnau, one of the most brilliant directors of the silent era, who believed that the ideal film dispenses with intertitles, and who thought throughout his career to dispense with cards. I based my research on such statements because I really wanted to better understand the reason for such a rejection. In fact, cards were not only something unwanted, but they were something unconsidered or discredited. Very few intertitles have been preserved, in fact. The George Eastman Museum in Rochester is probably the institution that preserves the highest number of intertitles in the world, but in its entire collection, there is only 24 titles amongst the 450,000 objects related to photography. This rarity of intertitles can be explained by the fact that they were most often destroyed once they had been filmed. At best, the glass plates on which the text was sometimes written or drawn were cleaned and then reused. Many painters were also reusing their cardboards, cleaning the lettering with plain water and a cloth, or a sponge. To compensate for the destruction of these primary sources, I spent a lot of time poring over articles in specialized journals. When I started my investigation, I had the impression that I could easily get lost because every research is full of false leads. So the sequences you see here, they're a good illustration of research work and of the tenacity it requires. The first problem I encountered was with the credits. Actually, people who were credited in the film credits under the term title by were not the letterer, but the intertitle writers. The letterers I was interested in were mostly invisible. They were simple workers and they received little to no recognition. So I juggled these best areas as best as I could. As you can imagine, it wasn't easy at first either to find my way around such a vast subject without relying on a reference study that seriously addressed the material question of intertitle production. Actually, there is no reference publication that discusses the career of intertitle letterers. There is no catalog that presents the variety of lettering or classifying them by any way, nor there is no documents that clearly list the typefaces used in the films. To date, I am not aware of any study that crosses the history of intertitles with that of their production techniques from a typographic point of view. So much, in fact, that I've come to wonder whether the world of silent film and the field of typographic research ever had the opportunity for a real encounter. But for me, this absence was actually an opportunity to invent many things and dare to hypothesize, thanks to some comparison, echoes, and personal intuitions. I ended up unearthing a lot of concrete information in the corporatist press about how titles were made and sometimes even recommendation for typefaces or lettering styles. I truly believe that typography, because of the rigidity and the precision it requires, can be a very efficient eye-opener. For example, by examining with rigor the shape of intertitles, by describing the letters, or even by analyzing their spatial layouts, we can formulate hypotheses about the way in which the cards were produced, the fonts used to typeset the intertitles can also provide reliable dating elements. And in return, I think that the study of these cards has much to contribute to the field of type and graphic design. The history of intertitles should be put into perspective with that of lettering. And all the shapes we discover on the cards are very singular, and they obviously constitute a breeding ground for references and type revival. To give you a flavor of all this research and to find our way in this vast history, I've prepared an overview covering the entire film period. I focused mainly on two countries, the United States and France. So I'm going to take a very quick look at the 3 decades of silent cinema, giving a few key dates and presenting some examples of intertitles that are striking from a typographic point of view. The chronological division you can see here into 5 parts is obviously artificial and a bit arbitrary, but at least it helped me to structure my thoughts, to put ideas in tension and to establish opposition. It made me realize that the film industry has always oscillated between accepting and rejecting intertitle. identifying a chronology forced me to ask myself in which cases hand painting or lettering was favored over typesetting titles. And in most cases, as you can imagine, it was the economic factor that prevailed. The appearance of the first opening titles has been quite well documented by film historians. Some notable researchers like Claire Dupré-Latour clearly detailed the transition from the old shows of the lanternists, the people who were screening still images during the 19th century by using glass plates, to the serialization of titles and intertitles directly on films. Among the selection I've made of some of these early titles, you will see that it's difficult to identify a common logic or a formal coherence. The letter forms are very different, and the messages, they vary in content as much as in length. Here, you can see Santa Claus, an 1898 film, and the first opening title card ever found. The lettering is clumsily executed, although it testifies a quest for visual impact. The capital letters are angular and very compact, and their broken curves are poorly matched by a haphazard use of space. Here, you can see the first ever intertitles. They are even more gestural. They are appearing on screen for just a few seconds, like a subliminal message to convey surprise and accidents. By comparison, the opening title of Drama at the Bottom of the Sea is highly dense and lacks visual effectiveness. It's like its function overshadows its aesthetic value. I mean, the title here has to convey many information to audiences of different nationalities, and so it includes 3 languages, so each translation is supposed to stand out thanks to a specific lettering and text size. But the last line devoted to the English title is the only one that has been said differently, with sans serif lettering that is remarkable at the time and in a smaller size to fit on one line. Scrooge, or Marley's Ghost, is a good example of a title whose composition seems inherited from the world of books. The layout seems inspired by the act in a theater play, and titles and subtitles are clearly distinguished by different typefaces. The intertitles for the Pathé Studio were systematically composed in capital sans serif letters in the same style, and they were often accompanied by the presence of the famous rooster logo, which identified the studios worldwide, and you can see them maybe on the upper image. As we can see from all these examples, the conception of the primitive title was still in flux. Filmmakers at the time were experimenting a lot with very different shapes and in opposite directions. Digging into the history of Thomas Edison Studio, we can see how technical changes have conceptual repercussions. The technical discoveries were clearly influencing the shape of the letters that appear on titles. Between 1902 and 1904, Edison Studios introduced opening titles and intertitles with very distinctive lettering derived from letter painting. But a new method adopted from 1904 onwards systematized the use of movable letters to compose intertitles. Some independent letters were inserted into a panel with horizontal grooves. So in 1904, Edison moved from the lettering model you see at the top of the screen to the sans serif at the bottom. And it might be counterintuitive, but the rigid shapes of movable letters were in fact to give filmmakers and designers a great deal of freedom. Because these letters are in volume and detached from each other, they are inviting to be moved around. Their quality as objects gave rise to inventions. A director like Edwin Porter sees intertitles as a new means of expression, not just a hindrance or a break in the filmic action. On these images, it's very easy to see how much fun Edwin Porter had with the stop motion technique, with which he animates the letters without them being visible. It's a good way of bypassing the necessary pause and the stability imposed by the act of reading cards. Around the year 1914, due to the First World War, most European studios were requisitioned. So moving images had already largely conquered the West, and even though French production had been partially interrupted, the United States was establishing itself on an international scale. The US was inventing an ever more efficient industry. At the time, mainstream entertainment, as we know it, was still in its infancy, but the codification of genres was already quite strong, and intertitles helped to give birth to the first blockbusters. Intertitles allowed cinema to stand on its own 2 feet. They had to free it from the huckster, actually. The huckster were these people who had previously been in the movie theater with the audience, commenting live on what was happening on screen. It was against this backdrop of effervescence that a new kind of intertitle appeared, the art title. On this type of card, the words are accompanied by more or less simplified drawings, so that the illustration creates a visual link with the preceding scenes or prepare to the arrival of the following shots. We owe these artistic titles to Hollywood producer Thomas H. Ince, who began advertising his invention widely in newspaper in 1915. In particular, Thomas Ince recruited a cartoonist named Mon Randall and a letterer named Irvin Martin to head his titling teams. It was actually a novel strategy and also a risky one, since the cost of producing hand-painted intertitles along with drawings was much higher than the traditional printing of text-only intertitles. What seems to matter to Thomas Ince is the pictorial dimension of intertitles, which lends an artistic nobility to cinema. This is emphasized to the point of overshadowing the lettering, which is nonetheless spectacular, as you can see here. And to me, these letterings deserve to be questioned, especially in terms of legibility on screen. Anyway, Thomas Ince and his teams were honoring a style that could seem common to many letterers, but which became their trademark, as recalled in an article in the American Printer. This style is described as eccentric in a lettering handbook by William Gordon, published in Cincinnati in 1918. It was later used in several handbooks under the name eccentric Roman, first with brushes and then with nibs, especially when the round-tipped nibs were introduced widely on the American market by the Speedball brand. These nibs made easier the work of letter painters. They were accentuating the monolinear aspect of lettering and speeding up the production rates. In this handbook from the late 20s, William Hugh Gordon suggests to alternate series of brush exercises and pen exercises. This makes perfect sense when you consider that Speedball's round-tipped nibs were patented by William Gordon himself, along with another letterer by the name of Ross F. George. Ross George also promotes the eccentric Roman style. I've even discovered that he wrote an article that features a very similar alphabet in 1928, almost 13 years after the first art titles were introduced. You can see more of Ross F. George work at Letterform Archive, where some of his original drawings and beautiful pictures like this one are now preserved. I find it very interesting that these lettering models were used on screen as well as in store windows. They could also be found on show cards. Show cards are these small hand-painted advertising cards that gave information on the price of an item, for example. And in these images, you can see a very elaborated one. So we discovered that many exchanges existed between cinema and the real world, between films and commercial matters and popular culture. But things were still very different in Europe at the time. After the First World War, a new generation of filmmakers emerged in France. In this chapter dedicated to the emergence of the avant-garde and the expressiveness of lettering, I'd like to talk about major figures such as Germaine Dulac and Louis Deluc, two filmmakers who initiated a major reflection on the aesthetics of cinematographic art. These early avant-garde gave pride of place to purely visual games, sometimes to the detriment of the stories and the subtext. There was indeed a clear evolution in the use of cards over the course of their careers. To take Germaine Dulac as an example, in a film like La Cigarette in 1919, she alternated between hand-painted art titles and intertitles that were typeset. At first, she made extensive use of text, then she completely banished intertitles in her later film experiment, in which conventional narrative also disappeared. Among the filmmakers of this period, Marcel L'Herbier stands out for his extreme attention to intertitles. L'Herbier theorized extensively about the art of filmmaking and, like his peers, he was wary of intertitles for fear that the act of reading would replace the act of seeing. But in the end, even though he would ideally like to do away with titles, he was quite pragmatic and decided to work meticulously on the composition of his titles. We even found in his archives some very precise drawings indicating where the text should be placed, how the text should be typeset, and so on. On the one hand, Marcel L'Herbier deplores the fact that the cinematograph is not yet able of expressing itself solely by means of the image. And on the other hand, he invents a subtle interplay between characters and images, relying on methods and even gimmicks inherited from the book layout tradition. He was clearly influenced, as you can see it on the bottom image, by experiments that are almost calligrammatic. 1920 saw the release of L'Herbier's first major success, entitled L'Homme du Large, and I strongly advise you to watch this film. The cards are dizzyingly rich. No fewer than 15 different styles coexist in the film, and they are always closely linked to the narrative, thanks to an ingenious system of image superimpositions and crossfades and like stuff like that. So these constant efforts at integration of intertitles speaks volume about L'Herbier's approach to linking text to moving images, resulting in an innovative interplay of words with static visual elements. 1920 also marked the beginning of Expressionism. One of the most famous cinematographic examples of this movement is the Cabinet of Dr. Caligari, but we could also mention Friedrich Murnau's Nosferatu, or many Fritz Lang films in which we discover some of the most expressive intertitles, always integrated into a total spectacle with a strong graphic interest and conveying new forms and shapes that echo the sets. Also, I would add that the acidic tinting of the films, often green, adds to the garish experience. On the other side of the Atlantic, the search for efficiency is always at the forefront. From a commercial perspective, American screenwriters specialized in writing intertitles. There were, at the time, many authors that were striving to create wit in a few words and to, let's say, energize stories in no more than 3 or 4 lines. The mastery of this new literature is a major factor in the acceptance of the growing number of intertitles. And to accompany this newfound importance of titles, some specific typefaces were being promoted and praised for their use in cinema. The Parson font, for example, designed in 1917 by Will Ransom, was widely used in the film and press industries in the US from, I would say, 1920 onwards. So this typeface is very easy to identify with its right-angled serifs and unclosed lowercase e and a. In my opinion, with its atypical silhouette, it really sets the tone for the century. Parson has also prompted more handwritten or hand-painted additions to intertitles, as you can see here at the end of the first line, because its ascenders of letters invite exaggeration, and its descenders are extended vertically to fit or to fill the spaces left empty in the rectangular space of the intertitles. 2 years after being released, this typeface is still omnipresent on intertitles. Let's take just a few examples here. Not only in the US, but also in France and in Sweden. In this 1925 catalog, the foundry Barnard Brothers and Spindler confirmed that Parsons' main destination is the screen, which is an absolute novelty. On this image, you can read, "You see it in screen pictures." The cinema studio's first instinct was to draw on an old typographic catalog. They were using Cheltenham, Caslon, and especially Bookman, that we saw in all Thomas Edison productions from 1910 onwards. These typefaces were generally chosen for their legibility, their fatness, and sometimes even for their monolinear appearance, which meant they were easy to photograph and created no contrast as well. Gradually, however, the boundaries between the worlds of film and foundry became more porous. In the 20s, for example, art craft, Packard, and souvenir were fonts that were regularly encountered. I haven't managed to find out more at the moment, but a handbook by William Gordon and an article by Rose George from 1928, I think, even suggest that typefaces imitating the work of intertitle letterers were cast specifically for the cinema. What we need to understand is that all this typographic research and development is attributable to the frenzy of the film industry and the fact that the need for title is accelerating. This was even more true in the period that followed. Between 1924 and 26, the production of big budget films required ever greater organization. The cards had to be mass produced quickly. As early as 1924, the Thomas In Studios so acquired new machines. The typographic composition of intertitles was internalized in the same studios that had sworn by lettering and hand-painted work only a few years earlier. 1924 also saw the founding of Pacific Titles, an independent company specializing in the creation of intertitles, which soon supplied every studio in the US with intertitles and made extensive use of the ERA font that you can see here. So much so that these typeface engraved by Gustav Schröder and also popularized under the name pastel became the emblematic typeface of silent film era. At the same time, the avant-garde research is continued. Some artists proposed short films that were shot and distributed outside the usual circuits. These research involved plastic experiments based on form of craftsmanship, sometimes more DIY methods. Because of the more limited budgets, because of the shorter formats of the films, the intertitles production is also approached very differently by them. Here I will take two examples taken from the filmography of Fernand Léger and of the artist Man Ray, which demonstrate that the avant-garde either tried to evict text from its work or more rarely tried to sublimate the intertitle by playing on a highly literary quality. Let's take Ballet Mécanique as an example. In this very famous short film by Léger and Dudley Murphy, it's quite difficult for the viewer to construct a narrative from the succession of visions that the film offers. The narrative intentions, if there were any, are almost impossible to decipher. The only textual element to which we can relate is this one. On a volé un collier de perles de 5 millions, meaning one stole a pearl necklace worth 5 million. This enigmatic message is not illuminated by the images that frame it. Research has even shown that neither the content nor the form of this intertitle was decided by Léger. The words are taken directly from a newspaper headline published in September 1940. It's proof that the meaning of the text is not Léger's first concern. He seems more interested in playing with letters and playing with numbers as beautiful shapes and graphic elements. Man Ray also got rid of intertitles in his early short films, in which he conducted visual experiments. In L'Étoile de Mer, he returned to poetry with a visual translation of a poem by Robert Desnos. He punctuates his film with some 15 intertitles, both typeset and beautifully hand-painted, whose form responds to the meaning of the verses through textural and blurred effects. But just when a common ground between poetry and cinema seems to have been found, like a symbol, the film closes with an intertitle split in two, painted on a broken glass plate. I'm getting a bit conceptual here, but there is a paradox that's very close to my heart in the very status of intertitles. We kind of ask intertitles to be images and to be forgotten among the moving images, whereas their function is precisely to bring a legible text to the screen, which demands fixity. So necessarily, these intertitles take us away from the continuous flow of images, and they lead us towards poetic territory, something that the artist Marcel Duchamp called more verbal regions. I like to recall this expression of verbal regions because it obviously invokes language and poetry, and because my approach to intertitles also overlaps with a Duchamp approach. I've often thought of intertitles as ready-made. There are some sort of ready-made text capable of to speak for us and to take on a different meaning as soon as we read them in a different context than the one for which they were originally conceived. Intertitles are autonomous and can be read as poetic fragments, and they also easily form a narrative when put together. I was lucky enough to put these principles into practice when I designed the posters for the Atelier National de Recherche Typographique call for application. And in my own writing practices, I often think with intertitle and through intertitles. Anyway, back to the point, to the great story of intertitles. Around 1925, two seemingly irreconcilable approaches coexisted. On the one hand, we were observing a kind of standardization in the commercial circuits, thanks to the fact that certain typefaces appeared more regularly on screen. And on the other hand, the avant-garde turned away from classic narrative schemes and they plunged into the search for pure art. European artists were advocating complete autonomy for cinema and once again firmly rejecting cards. Just as a sort of equilibrium was being found, an event occurred. An event that changed everything in the history of cinema. The Jazz Singer premiered on October 1927. This film included several singing scenes in which the sound was synchronized to the image using a new system. That's why the Jazz Singer is considered to mark the birth of talking pictures and consequently the disappearance of the intertitles. These technical advances came at a time when letterers had reached an astounding level of mastery, and directors and producers had developed a keen awareness of intertitles. They all knew the limitations of cards as well as the possibilities they offered, and above all, what they wanted to do with intertitles. The use of titles had been clarified, and at the time we're even witnessing the emergence of graphic thinking. I will give Alfred Hitchcock as an example, because I think his career symbolizes this graphic thinking. Hitchcock is best known for his masterpieces of the 50s and 60s, but he began his career in the silent era, working as an intertitle designer. In 1921, he even wrote an extremely interesting article on titles, in which he expresses himself precisely on the visual impact of one typeface rather than another, and in which he offers practical advice on the composition of intertitles. He also directed two silent films released in 1927, The Lodger and Downhill, which demonstrate very different but equally intelligent strategies for integrating text into film. The first movie is Downhill, a brilliant demonstration of how to integrate all possible textual material into a film to serve narrative needs. Cinema reflects the diversity of the signs that surround us, and these signs, they contribute to the progression of the action. Whether intertitles in this film are intra-diegetic or extra-diegetic, I mean, whether they are integrated into the film or not, the text is always driving force for suspense. The second Hitchcock film is The Lodger, a collaboration with a designer named Edward McKnight Coffer, who gives here intertitles real substance and sets them in motion in a very innovative way. This collaboration between Hitchcock and Coffer heralds the emergence of motion design. Here you can see two astonishing sequences that clearly anticipates the work of Saul Bass and the great artisans of modern credits who emerged 20 years later. Aside from Hitchcock, in 1927, the peril threatening silent cinema was not at all felt in the intertitles. Weirdly, intertitles were then at their peak. Letterer and printers dared to mix styles in a delightful way. Some Gothic lettering rubbed shoulders with geometric sans serif. The eccentric Roman lettering style endured, and the era typeface still reigned in big American production. All these shapes coexisted happily, and a frenetic production rhythm was found, but the roaring 20s were coming to an end. I'd like to say one last quick word in conclusion, because I still find it difficult to fully grasp the diversity of intertitles, as there were so many different ways of producing them. Intertitles were printed with various methods, as I said, including traditional printers and hot press printers, and the tools used for hand painting intertitles were equally varied. We could use brushes, round tip pens, and pastels. The inscribing media were very diverse as well. Glass plate, celluloid, black cardboard, white paper, Bristol cards, and last but not least, the formats varied widely, from 52 by 71 centimeters for the largest hand-painted title, date 1928, to 13 by 18 centimeters for the smallest printed title described by a French letter painter in 27 article. This diversity is precisely what makes these research topics so rich, and I believe it deserves to be extended by other studies to link the material and conceptual aspects of intertitle, as I've tried to do so far. What continues to fascinate me personally is that the intertitle is an object of absolute simplicity that raises some very complex questions. It's a simple fragment of black cardboard with a message painted or printed in white, which has been a common object used even frantically for 3 decades, and which 100 years later seems to have completely disappeared. Thank you.
Thank you, Julien.
Thank you very much.
Just do this one quick thing so I can move my background. Um, many multitasking things. Um, that was so fantastic. I knew that this period was like super rich and very intriguing, and has clearly, obviously, so much more to
It is
discover.
actually too much.
Yeah, no, but it's super interesting too. Again, a huge thank you for walking us through so concisely into a really rich topic that you just like so eloquently kind of walked us through the timeline and also the technology. But it's incredible to see and kind of to witness some of the stuff. I think what's interesting is like there's perhaps like a zeitgeist moment, but I've had several questions in the last couple of years through my role kind of in the Lubalin Center because of the material that we have here, specifically asking about silent film intertitles. And so it's at least like four people in the last 2 years. So clearly there's some sort of, vested interest that people have to pursue this. I'm so glad that we have a very significant starting point in this, and so I really appreciate your time with this. And there's always a question that typically happens in these lectures is if there's a book and there is a publication, correct? Poem Editions is just announced. Your
Yeah, exactly. I also wanted to mention that 2 days ago, I published a small book about a precise letterer named Victor Vance. And the book is available on the website of the publishing house Poem. It's, yeah, as I said, a precise study about a fascinating letter painter associated with the Warner Bros. Studio. And this man, Victor Vance, have a very distinctive style of lettering based on the virtuosic use of the brush. And he was, at the time, considered as a title artist. So if you want to know more about art titles, which is a very interesting notion, in my opinion, it's a perfect start. Yeah.
yeah, I see Tanya posted the link to it, and I just posted the link. So folks should definitely check that out. A huge plug for Poem Editions. Poem does these really wonderful super concise, beautifully produced. Oh, there you go. So you can have the whole set. They're amazing. I can't say enough good things about them. I just ordered yours, Julien, a couple of days ago, I think last week. So it's in the mail. It's coming to, but definitely folks should check out that pamphlet as well as the others. But there's so many interesting ideas and so much kind of so many boxes that kind of got ticked. Just even for names, like I'm familiar with Pencraft, like the typeface, and Parsons. And looking at the forms, it completely makes sense that they are corresponding to the intertitles,
Yeah.
and even the names now start to make much more sense. Like the it's not just Pencraft, which I just assumed was more of a, but it's connection to Artcraft, which is Artcraft, which is the company. So there's this like significance to the title that was completely missing for me. And also Ross F. George's work too, as well. It's kind of amazing. Let's see if there's definitely some questions in the Q&A.
Yeah.
Um,
First one was about the
Craig said you
sizes.
answered you answered about the site. Perfect. Um, let's try to put this up. I'll, I'll pin us together so we're uh, sorry, I just muted you by accident, Julian. I'm sorry.
Sorry. Yeah, there is one question about the time for the audience to read a complicated or artistic title. And it's true that it has been theorized a lot. I've I found many articles trying to deduct which time was the best and how many seconds per phrase we should have and so on. So it was clearly a concern for filmmakers at the time.
Mm-hmm.
They were, I'm not sure they were precising in the articles about the complexity of the text itself, but if there were an image, it was taken into account clearly.
Mm-hmm. There's a couple of questions. Yeah, I mean, I was fascinated by the one of the last few slides where you show the camera photographing. I was always curious, like what technology was used, and I imagine there's a variety because this is a new media. Everything is essentially being invented, even the idea of intertitles, and so I'm sure there's a myriad of forms, but it's really fascinating to see the device
Yeah.
with kind of a fixed width, a fixed distance, obviously for focal length, and
Yeah.
a dimension it can shoot.
As I said, there's not so many pictures about this kind of stuff and material because it was not really considered by the people at the time. So I
Yeah.
found as well some pictures of the letterers walking, but they are rare, very
Mhm.
rare. Yeah.
I wanted to ask you as you were talking and you showing especially the images of the articles, where you're finding this material and has it been easy to search? I imagine it's not, but I'm curious like where you're finding especially the articles.
Mainly articles and a few pictures in museum, but they were not even knowing anything about the archive. Like some of them, like the two pictures that are held in American museums, they had no information about the author or the exact date, or yeah, it was just things in some boxes. And I, to give you an example about the titles themselves, I asked them to take pictures of the objects themselves because they were not even pictured by the museums. They were so even today they were not considered as interesting stuff.
Hmm.
So,
Yeah, I curious also like how much in the I would imagine like I guess the motion picture like the sort of the
moving
big
images, yeah,
um
there is a yeah. I could send you a list of this. I've tried to make a recension of all this.
there was someone that was asking in the chat who the biggest producers of intertitles and you mentioned one of the names.
Yeah, there's many questions.
Folks, just if you can send the questions to the Q&A.
So I'm sorry I missed the question about the previous one.
Who were the biggest producers of intertitles? And you mentioned one of the companies, right, that kind of became
Yeah,
the
Pacific Titles has been very important in the US, and a thesis has been written about them in the 90s, I think. So it was one of the serious sources I had to investigate this. There is a question about the use of intertitles beyond the silent era. Why do you think filmmakers still found intertitles important even if they lost their functionality? I think for them nowadays they are more used as a chat to help to sequence the stuff to the film, like the having some chapters, and it can be like still very practical or useful, but they are I don't know, they cannot have, I think, the same flavor as we could use sound instead of writing it on screen. So it's very ambivalent and thing to me.
Mhm. Let's see, there's just going through from the top. Martin Mineski was asking, did the filmmaker allow more time for the audience to read? I think you answered this, right? Compared to.
Yes, I did.
Mhm.
Um, there, there is some non-Latin scripts intertitles, but I haven't focused on them because it would have been too much work, and I'm not. I'm only reading, unfortunately, Latin scripts, so
Mhm.
no clue
Yeah, and I
about
would
this.
imagine like as cinema, as the invention of cinema, as the technology was changing and moving across the world, locally, people would kind
Yeah,
of come up with their own ways of doing it. I'm also thinking too, like when you mentioned, relating to the question about like intertitles and text on screen past the silent film, is also like in television. I think we also start to see intertitles being used as a
yeah,
way to, like
to
for live
sequence
television.
or to present stuff. Yeah, as you do in your Zoom conference,
Yeah,
like this kind of
exactly. It's our
like.
new.
No, for real. Like it's the same kind of use that filmmakers do nowadays. But
Yeah, yeah.
um,
I don't know if you saw Tanya's question about the color in.
yeah, the color like tinting the prints with an art by itself. There were some precise instructions about how to do it to obtain certain colors, and there was some beautiful lines written on why we should use the green for this type of action, or the crescent blue, or they were naming the of course the color to match the situation.
Mhm,
And they were basic, yeah, mainly you could see red, blue, and green, and some sort of yellow.
mhm,
So they were clearly communicating with the images.
mhm. But was it usually like they essentially kind of would record the film, they would film the intertitles and splice them into the main film, right? So there would be essentially some kind of like photo reproduction so they could be the same
Yeah, yeah.
format that could
Well,
be placed in.
it really depends. So the problem is that on the first negative prints that you had, like if you would, of course, translate the movie, or like you wanted to sell it to another market, you would have problem not having the original one. So sometimes you can today like watch a silent film but not having the original intertitles because they were made apart.
Right. Yeah. 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 Of course, they would have to be like cut out and like replaced with something that's
Yeah,
yeah. Yeah. And then certainly like even in the 20s, there's films are moving country to country. There's a pretty active market of films being shown across the world. Like American films are going to Europe, European films are coming here. So
yeah,
obviously the language, and the change in the titles requires um even more questions to to investigate.
yeah.
Uh, let's see. Trying to make sure we have all the questions.
um, Considering making a compilation of video of intertitles, rendering a compilation as they were seen originally. I'm not sure I got it.
I think it's just like putting, kind of
Ah,
creating a
yeah, yeah,
video of
because yeah, I reckon it's very frustrating when I show some intertitles. I only show like a picture of it and not the one being serialized, and that's part of the flavor of intertitles, to see them moving a bit or some having some small effects on the film itself.
Yeah, I do I mean, I would imagine that most of these are probably in the public domain, right? Given their age. Do you know anyone who's compiled like a collection of the intertitles, so just focusing on the intertitles, or is that just something that
There is people interested in making collection of them, yeah, but at for what I know, there is no serious website dedicated to it.
Yeah, because I know there's at least a few websites specifically for titles, which, is more
But
contemporary.
opening titles, I
Yes, yeah,
think like the research have focused so far on the opening titles.
yeah, yeah. And this is like obviously like a much more extended research into the titles. Because I even just even there's not that many images online, for examples of intertitles. It's, and if they are, they're quite small, at least like in my very like
Yeah.
top, so there seems to be certainly more interest, and hopefully this talk inspires people to investigate on their own and kind of do a little bit of the additional research to get them.
I really hope to.
Yeah, yeah. Let's see, maybe one last question. If we didn't get to anything, or if we got to everything. Did you see the question about Duchamp and the ready
Yeah,
made
it's a tricky one. I
one? Yeah.
haven't I haven't thought about this, like about how intertitles might prefigure subsequent text, language in art. Yeah, obviously I see Margaret Swart that is quoted here, but I really don't know. Like, but what I can say is that clearly these, like the fact of for people of viewing so many films and reading some short text during 3 decades had affect their probably their conception of literature. And I think it was, as I said, especially in the US with the witty lines of the art titles and some screenplay writers specializing in titles, it was some sort of a new style of writing as well, not only drawing and seeing stuff. I don't know if it makes sense, but to me, it's yeah, it could have affect our vision of literature.
Mhm. Do you have a sense in, I mean, perhaps like in the flow of a film being made, would there be a special role for someone who would write intertitles? I'm just thinking like, is it part of the script? Like there's the script of the film,
Yeah,
and would there be just a separate person once the film is put together, or is the intertitles kind of part of the way it's shot? I mean, I'm just curious, like what role, how conscious are they of what the intertitle will
they
say?
were like they were once again in the US. It's a very interesting example because there was some sort of guild that that was created to write for all the Hollywood movies because it was a lot of money involved. So they created some sort of guild named the titular bishops,
What a great
and
name.
they, and they really wanted to keep the writing for themselves and not to sell it to anybody else. And they were specialized, and other people were specialized. It was a true job. I should mention here the research of somebody named Robinson. I don't remember his name now, but he investigated about somebody named Ralph Spence, an intertitle writer that had a crazy life writing titles, and he would even publish some ads in the explaining that he could save some bad movies into good movies only by writing good titles at the end. And it's some sort of editing the movies. I think it's very different from what you would expect from a well-written scenario. But some people they really knew that good titles could change the rhythm of the film and help the film to be better.
I mean, it's such an integral part of the experience of seeing a silent film. Like without those
Yeah,
titles, like it is the thing that kind of stitches the whole plot together and alludes to the things that are kind of invisible in that kind of filmmaking.
yeah,
Yeah, Craig mentioned like that some title writers are brought in to quote punch up a script after the filming was done to kind of give it that little bit of a change of the film. And Craig
yeah, exactly.
a
Yeah,
question that we missed. I think that might be our last question in terms of the titles being printed white or silver on black, or similar effect could be making black letters on white and then photographically reversed. Do you have a sense of
yeah.
which common, like reversing or the?
As I said, I think it was very diverse, and I have no idea of what was the majority of the thing. The Thomas Ince studio case is very interesting because you see that they promote something, and 2 years after they promote the opposite. So they are just, I think, researching and trying to find the best way, but they are always changing. So even for the photography of it, I have no clue.
Yeah. Well, more research to do, and like I said,
Yeah,
I hope that folks are intrigued enough. I think there's such a vast body of stuff to still to find, and archives are becoming more digitally available. So I think that's definitely like a time. I'm gonna post in the chat again a link to the poem edition, link to your publication, which I hope people can pick up and digest along with this video. We'll have hopefully interesting leads, and maybe we'll take up some research tasks depending on where folks are watching from in your country, or if you're in Hollywood or close to Hollywood, maybe you can
yeah,
look at the archives there and see what's there. Julian, thank you so much. This is such a great such a new window for myself and hopefully for the folks watching. I really appreciate your time and your insight and your expertise and just your passion for this. I'm sure it's not the end of this project, and it's kind of maybe I wouldn't say the beginning, but certainly kind of on the way there. And we hope that this could be helpful for folks to kind of get a bigger a view of this. So thank you
well,
again so much.
thank you very much for having me and for all the questions. Like,
Yeah,
thank you
thank
very
you. And thanks everyone. We'll see you in the summer. Julien, be well. Have a
Thank you.
great week. Thanks everyone.